Well, let's get started. I know we have a lot to talk through today. So first of all, welcome to ARC Talks, one in our series of webinars that we host. And delighted, and I'll introduce in a moment, Kristen, who's going to speak today. And Kristen, do you want to move on? I think you have control of the slides. Move on the slides. Just for those of you who are new to ARC, the Amyloidosis Research Consortium, a little bit of background on who we are. We're a nonprofit organization with our mission to improve and extend the lives of those with amyloidosis. We have 4 areas that we focus on: improving the speed and accuracy of diagnosis. Many of you will have experienced significant delays in getting diagnosed, so it's vitally important to get diagnosed earlier. Understanding the science behind the disease so that we can help shape and develop the next treatments that come along. Accelerating the development of those treatments and regulatory approval. And that really is where clinical trials falls into, and we'll be hearing about those today. And then also supporting patients and ensuring that they have the best quality of care throughout their journey with amyloidosis. Next slide. Thank you. And just a quick thank you to our supporters and also the individual donors that contribute. Without donations, programs like this and our other support programs wouldn't happen. So we're very grateful for those. Next slide. So webinar is being recorded, and if we will be sharing the recording afterwards, we'll also have the slides available, and the slides are detailed for that reason that we can share them and you can look at them in more detail. Kristen will not be going through everything on them. This, you'll see on the bottom of your screen, there's a little box with a Q&A. If you have any questions as they arise throughout, please type them into the box as they come to you. And then when Kristen finishes, we'll spend a little time going through the questions and get to as many as we can. If you're having trouble with the audio, you'll see in the invitation there is a number that you can use to dial in, and you can dial in to listen as well. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce Kristen, who is our Executive Director of Research. She has a phenomenal experience across amyloidosis and has worked with us for nearly 10 years. And also comes with a background of having worked with biotech and pharmaceutical companies, so real experience in the design and development of clinical trials. So who better than to present this webinar on an update? And this webinar is focused just on ATTR amyloidosis. If you have other types of amyloidosis, in particular AL, we have similar webinars that are available in the ARC Talks resources, or you can email us to get a link to those. Kristen, I'm happy to hand over to you.
Wonderful. Hi, everyone. Like Isabel said, my name is Kristen Sue. I'm the Executive Director of Research here at the Amyloidosis Research Consortium. As Isabel mentioned, my background prior to joining ARC was working in clinical trials. So from really large studies, first initially in Alzheimer's disease before moving into designing studies in the rare and ultra rare space. And what I really love about working in rare disease is that you really have to work directly with the patients and understanding from patients' perspectives how they experience the disease, how treatments might potentially benefit them, what the impact is on different aspects of their life in order to adequately develop treatments and clinical trials. And so I'm very excited to be here today to talk to you about some of the clinical trial updates that are happening or some of the updates in clinical trials that are ongoing in TTR amyloidosis. I'm going to go over first what causes TTR amyloidosis and the different treatment mechanisms that are being studied to a degree, but most of the discussion itself is going to be around the clinical trials themselves. If you are a newly diagnosed patient, you're coming here for the first time, just starting to learn about the disease, this might be a lot to take in. Starting with some of the resources on our website, our disease booklets, which you can download from the website, order hard copies, is probably the first best step, but I'll do my best to cover as much as I can today. As Isabel mentioned, take screenshots, share anything you like with your doctor to ask questions and discuss in more detail. We will post this webinar on our website. You'll also have access to the slides, so you can print from there. So you can access the content, refer back to it whenever you need. I repeat this webinar every 6 months as new developments are available to share. So I'll be doing this again probably around the January timeframe. Today we are going to cover TTR amyloidosis. If you have AL amyloidosis, you can find a similar talk that I did on trials for AL amyloidosis back in April on our website. You can either access it here directly on the website, or you can go to our YouTube channel and find it there. I'll do the next talk for AL amyloidosis clinical trials in the fall with the most up-to-date information in that respect. Now, if you've joined these calls before, you know that I typically start by going over some of the basics of clinical trials, what they are, what the different phases are, what's involved, what the potential benefits and risks might be. I have all of this information on the slides that are going to be available, which will be on the website. We'll send them to you. For today, the most important piece of information I want you to understand is that I'm going to focus my talks on the interventional clinical trials of novel treatments. So trials that evaluate whether an investigative drug or treatment is safe and effective for patients. I'm not going to cover all of the ins and outs of the different phases, the different assessments, the risks, the potential benefits. The information's on the slides. You can definitely feel free to put questions in the Q&A, and I'll come back to them the best that I can. But I want to be mindful of time, and there's so much information to get through. And so I'm going to skip over these particular slides, though they are going to be available and sent to you after the webinar. Oops, sorry. All right. So now, before we dive into the specific clinical trials that are recruiting in TTR amyloidosis, I think it's important to understand the different approaches that are being studied to treat amyloidosis. I'm going to go over this at a high level. Dr. Jan Griffin did a really great talk, ARC Talks, back in June, last month. That's on our website, where she really goes into fantastic detail about all of the different approaches, the data behind each drug. I just want to make sure we all have a common understanding of the rough approaches that are being taken to understand the different trials and how they might be different. So we're going to start with how the disease works. This is covered in great detail in our booklets on our website. I'm just going to go over some of the basics to make sure we have a good sense of the different treatments. Now, TTR amyloidosis starts with the protein transthyretin, or TTR. We all make and have TTR. It's a protein that's used to transport thyroxine, which is your thyroid hormone, and retinol, vitamin A, throughout the body. Now, most of our TTR is produced by the liver, but there are small amounts that are also made in the choroid plexus of the brain and in the retina, but the majority of TTR is made by the liver. Now, in its native state, in its natural state, it's typically made up these 4 different subunits, which that combine into this 4-part tetramer. Now, in TTR amyloidosis, the tetramer becomes unstable, either through a genetic mutation, if you're somebody who has hereditary TTR amyloidosis, or with aging, which is known as wild-type TTR amyloidosis, and dissociates into these 4 different subunits, or monomers. The monomers then misfold and aggregate into amyloid fibrils, which deposit in organs like the heart and the peripheral nerves, causing damage. If you have TTR amyloid fibrils in your peripheral nerves, it's referred to as TTR polyneuropathy. If you have TTR amyloid fibrils in your heart, it's referred to as TTR cardiomyopathy. And so with that in mind, how do we actually treat amyloidosis, TTR amyloidosis? Now, I'm going to compare treating TTR amyloidosis to filling a bathtub. Or I'm going to compare TTR amyloidosis to filling a bathtub and what you need to do in order to treat it or to empty it. Now, in this analogy, think of the dripping water. Think of a bathtub with dripping water as misfolded TTR protein that is aggregating and forming amyloid fibrils. And the bathtub is your heart or your nerves or the different organs that might be affected. You can see that you start with an empty tub, which are your healthy organs, and over time, the water fills up into that tub, similar to a faucet of TTR proteins, which then misfold, form these fibrils that accumulate, and then deposit throughout the body. Now, in order to fix or treat that full bathtub, one of the first things you could do is turn off the water. You could turn off the faucet, slow down or stop the production of TTR amyloidosis, of TTR. When the rate of the TTR production is slowed or stopped, there isn't as much protein there to misfold, and the amyloid buildup declines or halts, and the organ function stabilizes. Now, in order to remove the accumulated amyloid, you'd have to actually drain that tub to get rid of all of the existing amyloid. In an ideal scenario, you'd be both turning off the faucet and draining the tub at the same time in order to prevent future production of amyloid, as well as clear the existing amyloid. And so again, in order to stop TTR production, the accumulation of that misfolded protein, you want to turn off the faucet to slow it down, to halt it entirely, and then you'd want to drain the tub in order to get rid of the existing amyloid. And so now let's bring that back to the different investigative treatments, approaches that are being used to treat TTR amyloidosis. Now, there are a number of different approved products, treatments, and investigative products that are designed to turn off that faucet or to slow it down. And so these are generally known as your TTR knockdown agents or your TTR stabilizers. Both of these work by turning off that faucet, slowing down the production and the accumulation of misfolded TTR amyloids, TTR. So knockdown agents, these are those ones here on the far left: patisiran, inotersen, vutrisiran, eplontersen, as well as nex-z, nexigerin, ziclumerin, and nucresiran. These are products that are designed to inhibit the production of TTR altogether. So healthy TTR as well as unstable TTR, preventing the amyloid from forming, building up, and accumulating in your organs. TTR stabilizers, which are these next column here, these are actually molecules that bind to the TTR protein and stabilize it so that it prevents it from dissociating into those 4 different monomers, which then misfold and lead to amyloid fibrils. So knockdown agents and TTR stabilizers work in different ways, but essentially they're both turning off that faucet so that your organs are not filling up with further TTR amyloid fibrils. Now, in order to drain the tub, there are a number of different anti-fibril agents, monoclonal antibodies that have the ability to target a specific protein or harmful cell, in this case, pre-existing amyloid deposits, and ideally, ultimately, we hope remove them from your organs. And so we've got 2 anti-fibril agents that are currently in development now. I'll walk through these shortly. You can see on this slide that the products that are in black are currently approved by the FDA and available for patients with TTR amyloidosis in the US. Keep in mind, TTR amyloidosis, it has 2 main subtypes, wild type and hereditary, which are then further classified as TTR polyneuropathy and TTR cardiomyopathy. So you can see that some of the drugs that are noted here are approved for patients who have hereditary TTR amyloidosis with polyneuropathy, but are still being studied for patients with cardiomyopathy. So that's where you see these little asterisks. Separately, we've got a drug that's approved for TTR cardiomyopathy, but is still being studied for another indication for TTR carriers, which I'll talk about shortly. But you can kind of see the 3 different main classes of drugs on this slide. Okay, so that's generally how TTR amyloidosis happens, or what causes it, and then how the different approaches that are being used to treat it. For the remainder of my time, I'm going to review some of the key interventional clinical trials that are recruiting in TTR amyloidosis. We'll be reading out over the next year or so to keep an eye on for TTR amyloidosis, and then some future trials that are planned. I'm not going to review every study that's happening in TTR amyloidosis. It's more than I could cover during this time, but I'm going to focus on the trials that have novel therapies for TTR amyloidosis, so new and innovative therapies. Okay, this slide is one that we're going to come back to a few times moving forward. You can see along the left the different the different classes of drugs, the names of the drugs, the indication they're being studied in, and where they stand in an overall drug development pathway to ultimately leading to approval. This slide looks so different than it did a few years ago, with now 7 approved, drugs in TTR amyloidosis. It's remarkable to see. There's been incredible progress made, but we know there's still, a high unmet need from a patient perspective, and we're excited to see additional development moving forward. Now, some of you might have joined my the last call that I did reviewing TTR clinical trial updates in January. And so I'm going to just briefly highlight, before I go through everything, what's changed since January. So if the only thing that you joined today is to kind of see what those new developments are, can give that information to you up front, so that you have it and you can decide how best to use your time. I'm still going to circle back and go through each trial, but I want to start with just some of the developments that have happened since January. One of the biggest pieces we're really excited to see is that the FDA has approved vutrisiran, which is known as commercially as Amvuttra in the United States, for the treatment of TTR cardiomyopathy in March of 2025. So that phase 3 study, Helios-B, that we had all been tracking and looking forward to seeing a decision on, is now currently available. Most recently, Alnylam has initiated a phase 3 study of nucresiran in TTR cardiomyopathy. This is known as the TRITON-CM study. I'm going to cover this in the next few trials, or in the next few slides, but a new large phase 3 study with a follow-on product, nucresiran, in cardiomyopathy. And they have a phase 3 study in polyneuropathy planned to start by the end of this year. The next big update is that the recruitment for the DepleTTR-CM trial, so this is the Alexion 2220, the anti-fibril therapy, anti-fibril antibody treatment for TTR amyloidosis. That phase 3 study has actually completed recruitment. And so it enrolled quite quickly, which is a great thing. The study is currently ongoing. Patients are going to patients on the study are going to continue to receive treatment over the next couple of years, but recruitment has now completed. And I'll talk about timing for when we might look to that study to read out. And then lastly, Atralis is a company that had been developing a pan-amyloid therapy known as AT02. This is another anti-fibril antibody for TTR cardiomyopathy. They are going to continue studying this anti-fibril in patients who have AL amyloidosis with renal involvement, but my understanding is that there are no future studies planned for AT02 in TTR amyloidosis. So the two anti-fibril agents that are moving forward in TTR amyloidosis are Coramitug, which you can see here. There's a phase 2 study that we're reading results for, and then the Alexion ALXN 2220, the DepleTTR-CM study, which has completed recruitment. I'm going to walk through all of these, but just wanted to make sure, for those of you who are just looking for an update, those are kind of the main updates that have happened since January. All right. So now let's move forward. When I do these calls, I typically cover first the trials that are recruiting. So if you're looking to get involved in a clinical trial, where to go to first. I'll then talk about some of the studies that are going to be reading out over the foreseeable future, and then future planned studies. So we'll start with the 4 trials that are currently recruiting for TTR amyloidosis today. And these are the 4 trials that are outlined here in red. So it includes a phase 3 study for acoramidis in asymptomatic gene carriers, the TRITON-CM study, the nucresiran cardiomyopathy phase 3 study, and then 2 studies for nex-z, which is a gene editor that is being studied in both TTR cardiomyopathy and polyneuropathy. I'm going to start from top to bottom and go in that order. And so we'll start with the acoramidis phase 3 study, which is called the ACT Early study. This is a TTR stabilizer. So again, acoramidis works. It's currently approved for the treatment of patients who have TTR cardiomyopathy. In this case, this is kind of a funny study to start with as part of this presentation, because it's a study for individuals who have a confirmed TTR genetic mutation, but who don't actually have TTR amyloidosis yet. They don't have cardiomyopathy or polyneuropathy. This is a study that's looking to see whether treatment with acoramidis can actually prevent or delay the development of disease in participants who have confirmed TTR genetic mutations. So if you're a patient who has V122I or V30M or T6D-ALA, which are the most common mutations in the United States, but certainly not representative of all. If you're a patient who has a confirmed TTR genetic mutation, but you haven't actually developed any symptoms of the disease yet, this is a study that might be of interest to you. So this is a study that's going to evaluate whether acoramidis could potentially prevent or delay the onset of disease by measuring how long it takes gene-positive individuals to develop active disease, whether that be polyneuropathy or cardiomyopathy. We would hope that treatment with acoramidis would prevent someone from actually getting the disease, or at the very least delay how soon they might get it. And so in this study, participants are going to be monitored regularly to see if and when they develop TTR cardiomyopathy through biopsy or imaging, or if they develop TTR polyneuropathy based off of the onset of new signs, symptoms, as well as organ biopsy. The tricky thing with the study with prevention studies like this is that it's really hard to anticipate or know when somebody who has a genetic mutation will go on to get symptoms, or even if they will go on to get symptoms at all. We know that not everybody who has a positive genetic mutation will go on to develop active disease. And so studies like this are challenging because you don't really have a hard time point for each patient that you're looking for. There is data to suggest that most gene carriers who develop the disease are going to develop it around the same time, the age of the family member who passed the mutation onto them. It's not exact, and so the study will recruit individuals who are within 10 years of age or older, 10 years of that age that their family member that developed the disease or older. If you're somebody whose family history is unknown, then there's some published data to suggest what the predicted age of onset will be in the literature. And so that will be the time point where the study team would assess whether you might be a good candidate. And so for an example, if the predicted age of disease onset for a given individual is found to be 50 years of age, based off either off of family history, so that's when your parent or your grandparent developed the disease, or through the literature, then the age of the participant has to be between 40 and 75 years in order to qualify for the study. If your parent developed the disease at 50 and you're 30 years old, you won't qualify for the study yet. You've got to be within 10 years of when your parent actually developed the disease. Now, each of these studies that I'm going to review, this one and each of the remaining, have dozens of specific criteria that patients need to meet in order to be eligible to qualify for the study. It's not uncommon. In fact, it's quite regular for studies to have 40 different criteria that you would need to meet in order to qualify. I'm not going to cover 40 different criteria for each of these studies. I'm only going to highlight some of the ones that I think are probably key and ones that you yourself might know about your own medical history and your own medical status to decide whether this might be a good study for yourself. So there are other criteria involved, but I'm going to limit how much I go through for each study. This study is going to enroll 582 participants. The study will study acoramidis, which is a daily tablet. It's given twice a day. It's important to understand, with that said, not everybody who participates in this study will receive acoramidis. This is a placebo-controlled study. Placebo is a product that's like the study drug, but without the active ingredients, kind of like a sugar pill. And so in this study, participants will be randomly assigned by chance to receive either acoramidis or placebo. Each participant will have a 1 in 2 or a 50% chance of receiving acoramidis and a 1 in 2 chance of receiving placebo. It's a double-blinded study, and what that means is that neither participants nor their study doctors are going to know whether the individual participant is receiving acoramidis or placebo until the end of the study. And I want to say that's the case for each of the subsequent studies that I'm going to review. And so participants won't know until the end what they actually receive. This is also an event-driven study. It's meaning that the study is going to complete after a certain number of participants go on to develop TTR cardiomyopathy or TTR neuropathy. And so, again, we can't predict exactly how long that's going to take. It's going to require a certain number to transition into active disease, but we're estimating that individual participation could be up to 7 years to allow for enough events to occur. There is going to be an open label extension study offered to participants who complete this initial study and then go on to develop TTR cardiomyopathy. In that case, all the patients will be able to enroll in that extension study and know that they're receiving acoramidis as part of it. If they're diagnosed with polyneuropathy, they'll need to go on to standard care as part of outside of the ACT Early program. I've included the clinical trial website if you want to read more about it. And then I'll also show how you can find the study on My Amyloidosis Pathfinder and through clinicaltrials.gov in later slides. This is a large study, 582 patients. It's open across the world. It's currently open in the US, Bulgaria, France, Italy, Netherlands, and Spain. There are additional countries planned in North and South America, Europe, as well as the Asia Pacific. And it's currently recruiting at 16 different centers in the United States. I've noted the states and locations here. Hopefully my placement of stars is in the general vicinity of these cities. There will be additional US centers opening over the next few months, and I anticipate additional countries as well. But just know that this trial opened towards the end of the beginning of 2025, and it takes so much so much goes into opening countries to particular studies as well as individual centers. And so additional centers will be opening over the next few months, but it can take quite a while for some specific centers, institutions, and countries to be able to participate. All right. The next study I'm going to focus on is one that I mentioned earlier. So this is a study called the TRITON-CM study, and it is a study that is evaluating nucresiran. It's evaluating the safety and efficacy of nucresiran, which is a gene silencer similar to patisiran or vutrisiran, for those of you who are familiar with the currently available TTR treatments. It's similar to patisiran and vutrisiran. Differs in that it requires dosing only twice a year. So if you're somebody who's being treated with TTR polyneuropathy with patisiran, that's an IV infusion every 3 weeks. Vutrisiran is a quarterly subcutaneous injection. Nucresiran is now a subcutaneous injection that is only required twice a year. And it's going to be studied in both patients with TTR cardiomyopathy who have wild type or hereditary TTR. And so this is going to evaluate the efficacy of nucresiran compared to placebo in reducing all-cause mortality and cardiovascular events. And so one quick obvious question is, what is efficacy? Efficacy is the ability of a drug to produce a desired effect in expert hands and under ideal circumstances. And so it's typically a measurement of whether a patient feels better, whether they function better, or whether they live longer. So this study is going to evaluate whether nucresiran reduces the risk of death and recurrent cardiovascular events like hospitalizations or urgent heart failure visits compared to patients who are on placebo. Now, in order to qualify for this study, patients need to have a medical history of heart failure. They need to have NT-proBNP is a cardiac biomarker that, if you have TTR cardiomyopathy, is commonly used to as part of the staging to determine how severe your cardiomyopathy is. You need to have an NT-proBNP level between 300 nanograms per liter and 8,500 nanograms per liter. If you're somebody who has AFib, there are slightly different levels, which I've noted here. Importantly, in order to participate in this study, you can't have any prior use with a TTR lowering therapy like vutrisiran or patisiran, and you can't have any current use with those drugs either. And so you have to be somebody who's not currently on any of the gene silencers or the TTR knockdown agents and don't have prior experience with those. With that said, if you're on a stabilizer like acoramidis or tafamidis, you're allowed to continue on those stabilizers and take part in this study. The study is going to enroll 1,250 patients, and as I mentioned, nucresiran is given as a subcutaneous injection under the skin every 6 months. Patients who participate in this study will be randomly assigned by chance to receive either nucresiran or placebo. Each patient will have a 2 out of 3 or a 66.67% chance of being assigned to nucresiran and a 1 in 3 chance of being assigned to placebo. This is another event-driven study, a double-blind event-driven study, meaning that we don't know when exactly it will complete. We need to wait for enough events to happen across the entire study population. But we're expecting that participation could last up to 5 years for an individual participant in order for enough events to happen in order to assess efficacy. This study just started recruiting this month, I think. So I've noted the website here, and you can see that it's currently open in the US, but there will be additional countries that will be opening over the course of the next few months to the year. There are 2 centers currently recruiting in the US. So in Cumming, Georgia, Boston should be getting started shortly. But again, there will be dozens of additional centers that open up over the next few months. And so this is one to, if you're interested in participating, to pay close attention to which study centers are opening and where, as you're considering what might be the best center for you to seek recruitment. Okay, so we've covered acoramidis, we've covered nucresiran, and so now I want to cover 2 studies that are recruiting for a product known as nex-z. Nex-z, formerly known as NTLA-2001, is a gene editor. So this involves the CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technology, in which you're actually taking out the bit of DNA that would prompt your body to actually go on and produce the TTR protein. And so this is the first study, the Magnitude-CM study, is a study that is evaluating the safety and efficacy of nex-z in patients with TTR cardiomyopathy, both wild type and hereditary. The study is going to evaluate whether nex-z works by assessing whether treatment with it reduces the risk of cardiovascular related events. So death, urgent heart failure visits, and cardiovascular hospitalizations. In order to qualify for the study, patients need to have a medical history of heart failure, as well as NT-proBNP levels greater than 600 picograms per milliliter, less than 10,000 picograms per milliliter. Or sorry, 600 picograms per milliliter is the lower bounds, and then lower than 10,000. You also, because this is a gene editor, patients, in order to qualify for the study, can't have had any treatment with TTR gene silencers over the past 12 months. So patisiran, inotersen, eplontersen, and they can't have had any prior experience with vutrisiran or Amvuttra. So if you have ever taken vutrisiran or Amvuttra, you will not qualify for this study. If you have taken patisiran, inotersen, eplontersen, and have been off it for at least 12 months, then you might qualify for this study. If you're currently taking a stabilizer, you just need to be on a stable dose prior to enrolling, but you can continue on that stabilizer in order to qualify. So unlike nucresiran or acoramidis, nex-z is administered as a one-time IV infusion. So it's an injection directly into the vein, one time, one and done. It's important to note, again, as part of the study, not everybody's going to receive nex-z. Patients will be randomly assigned to nex-z or placebo. They'll have a 2 out of 3 chance of receiving nex-z, 1 out of 3 chance of receiving placebo. This is another event-driven study. We know that patients will have everybody who enrolls will be on drug will remain on study for at least 18 months, but we're estimating that it could be about 4 years will be the average, or it could be up to 4 years will be the upper bounds of participation for individual patients in order to allow enough events to happen in order to assess efficacy. And I've included the study website here for those of you who are interested. The study is going to enroll 765 patients across the world. It's currently recruiting at 127 different centers in 17 different countries, which is remarkable. I've noted all of the 35 US centers that are currently recruiting here on this slide. And again, this will be available to you afterwards. The last study that's recruiting is another one that is evaluating nex-z. So our CRISPR-Cas9 gene editor, but it's unlike the last study, which was looking at patients who had TTR cardiomyopathy. This one is evaluating the efficacy and safety of nex-z in patients with TTR polyneuropathy, specifically patients who have hereditary TTR polyneuropathy. This study is going to evaluate whether patients who were treated with nex-z perform better on clinical measurement of peripheral neuropathy tests, which involve a series of short tests of motor and sensory impairment. In order to qualify for this study, patients need to have a confirmed diagnosis of hereditary TTR polyneuropathy, cannot have advanced heart failure, and similar to the last study, although slightly more restrictive, can't have any prior experience with gene silencers. So patisiran, vutrisiran, inotersen, or eplontersen. For that reason, this study is actually only being conducted in regions that have limited access or no access to these gene silencers. And so the study itself is actually not going to be taking place in the US. This is a study that's happening in countries that don't have any access or have limited access to those gene silencers. And so patients are going to be randomized as part of the study. They'll have a 50-50 chance of receiving nex-z or placebo. There is the opportunity to cross over to active treatment after 12 or 18 months on the study. And so you can see here that it's going to enroll 50 patients. It's a smaller study, but it's currently open in Argentina, Brazil, New Zealand, Singapore, and Taiwan. And so those are the 4 studies that are currently recruiting in TTR amyloidosis for interventional trials of novel therapeutics. I want to switch gears slightly to look at upcoming milestones. So these are things to keep an eye on. And we're going to start with so I've got these 4 different studies highlighted here in red that we're going to start with. We're going to start with by looking at the planned study of nucresiran and TTR polyneuropathy, and then we're going to look at detail. And so we know that study will start by the end of 2025. We're waiting for details around the design of that study, but that is going to be something that's going to come up over the next 6 months. What I want to spend most of the time looking at is the 3 trial readouts that are outlined here in red. The eplontersen cardiomyopathy study, which should be reading out in 2026, a phase 2 study for Coramitug, which will be reading out later this year, and then the Alexion 2220 study, which completed enrollment, and we expect results in 2027. And so these are all studies that are currently ongoing. They are no longer recruiting, unfortunately, but we expect data to be coming out to provide some insights as to how these products might work and whether they will continue in development or move on to regulatory submission and hopefully approval. And so I'll start with eplontersen, the CARDIO-TTRansform study. Eplontersen is a gene silencer, similar in that regards to vutrisiran, patisiran, inotersen. It is administered as a subcutaneous injection every 4 weeks and is currently approved for the treatment of TTR polyneuropathy in hereditary TTR patients, being studied in patients with TTR cardiomyopathy, which is currently in the largest phase 3 study to date, known as the CARDIO-TTRansform study. When I started my career, I was working in Alzheimer's phase 3 studies that were generally like 1,250 patients large. And so the fact that we've got a phase 3 study in what is still considered a rare disease that's 1,400 patients is pretty remarkable. The study is assessing whether treatment with eplontersen improves outcomes of cardiovascular mortality and recurrent cardiovascular events compared to placebo. And so results from this study are expected to be shared in 2026. And so we'll look forward to that as we learn more, and as the data becomes available, we'll of course notify the community. But this is something to keep an eye on, as it's a potential, if the study is positive, potentially would move on towards regulatory submission and hopefully approval. Coramitug is an anti-fibril, an anti-amyloid fibril, so a depleter product. So this is a product that is a anti-amyloid monoclonal antibody designed to prevent new TTR amyloid fibril formation and clear previously deposited TTR amyloid present in the affected organs through stimulation of antibody-dependent phagocytosis. So working your body's immune system to clear it on its own. This is currently being studied or just recently a study completed in patients with TTR cardiomyopathy in a phase 2 study. So this was evaluating 2 different levels of Coramitug primarily over a 64-week period, looking at change in the 6-minute walk test, as well as change in NT-proBNP, that cardiac blood biomarker. We're expecting the results for this study sometime in 2025, and if positive, hopefully additional studies will be planned with Coramitug moving forward. But this is something to keep an eye out on, as we do expect to find out if the phase 2 study was positive, and if it will move forward into phase 3 or subsequent studies. So this would potentially be a future study in the next few months to year. And then the last study I'll cover is the depleter cardiomyopathy study. And so this is this is another large phase 3 study that just completed recruitment with over the last few months, evaluating the safety and efficacy of Alexion 2220, which is another anti-amyloid fibril depleter, targeting the active removal of pre-existing amyloids and the restoration of heart function and elasticity in adult patients with TTR cardiomyopathy, both of those who have wild type or hereditary or variant type. And so this was a large study. Again, 1,158 patients ended up being recruited in quite a short time frame, which is really exciting to see just how much active involvement and enthusiasm the community has for this and for any of the studies that are currently recruiting and ongoing. This is given as an intravenous or infusion or an injection into the vein every 4 weeks. And the study just completed recruitment over the last few months. And so if memory serves, the study will continue until the last patient enrolled has had 2 years of treatment. So 2 years from roughly this time frame is when it would read out. And it's and so one of the questions we commonly get is, once a study completes and once results read out, how soon until that drug might be available to the broader community? We get this question all the time. And so I put together some rough timelines. These are, so the short answer is that approval timelines can vary, and that there are many different steps along the way. Some of these are steps that need to be taken by the drug developer. Some of these are steps that happen with FDA. Some of these are joint activities that require work by both the drug developer and FDA. But this is like kind of what I use as my like yardstick in terms of how long it would take. And so once the last piece of data is collected from a study, again, this is my timeline. This is not every company's timeline. It may differ quite a bit from some companies' timelines. But I would say generally, rule of thumb, you can estimate it will take about 3 months for that drug developer to clean all the data and for them to have the initial results available that they can share with the community that a study met its endpoint or didn't. Assuming that it's positive, that the study did meet its endpoint, it can take, on average, about 6 months for the drug developer to then put together the package that actually goes to FDA for FDA to review it. There are hundreds of pieces of information that go into those packages. They are meticulously put together and curated, and that takes a considerable amount of time. So from data collected to when they have results, 3 months. From when they might be ready to submit to the FDA, another 6 months. Some companies will go faster, some companies will take longer, but 6 months is kind of an average. Once the FDA receives a package from a company, they have about 60 days to check it for completeness. And then once they confirm that it's complete, the typical review timeline for FDA is 10 months from the point that they confirm that it's complete. If a company has what's called priority review designation, it can be as short as 6 months, but typical time frame is about 10 months. Now, even with that said, there are so many things that can influence whether they still have a decision by the end of that 6-month or 10-month time frame. There are things that if they need to call an advisory committee, that can slightly move the time frame. If a company has breakthrough therapy designation or fast track designation, that can help to accelerate the timeline a bit. This is a very resource heavy activity, and so resources at FDA, review capacity impact this. If the submission is of poor quality or not complete, FDA will have questions, and that actually each time they ask a question to a company, it stops the clock in terms of how long they have to review it. And so if it's not a high quality submission, if FDA has requests for additional information, that can push out how long it takes. And so all that to say, this is a rough time frame. But going back to like the Alexion, the ALXN 2220 study, for example, so we know that the last patient enrolled just several months ago on clinicaltrials.gov. You can actually look up like what companies, drug developers, study sponsors project as the primary completion date for the study. And so I believe they've noted that the study will complete in June of 2027. And so if we say that that's going to be the date of the last bit of data is collected, then we can say that I would estimate that you could potentially see results 3 months from that time point, September of 2027. If they take 6 months to review, to put together the submission, they might submit it in March of 2028. And then if it's a regular review, the traditional 10-month review period, if it's the 10-month review period, it would be potentially FDA decision by March of 2029. If they have priority review, it could be as early as November of 2028. These are all my calculations, back of the envelope, should not be considered formal timelines, but I just want to give you an idea of once a study completes, how long it might actually take for a drug to be approved by FDA, assuming that all things go well, the data is positive, and traditional timelines are used. So that was a lot to go through in a short amount of time. It also, as I mentioned, it only represents a portion of the amyloidosis trials that are currently recruiting. There are a number of imaging trials looking at different molecular tracers that are currently recruiting. There are a lot of single center trials that are currently ongoing, company registries, which are in real world evidence studies, which are actually really important to understand the context of, or really important in the context of understanding efficacy and side effects of the currently approved therapies. As you saw, most of these trials are really looking to see whether, at least in TTR cardiomyopathy, they're reducing the risk of mortality and different cardiovascular events, but they're not really telling us whether patients are feeling better, if the drugs are necessarily improving quality of life, symptoms. And so some of these company-sponsored registries and real-world evidence studies are actually starting to pull together that data, so we might better understand and identify ways to measure disease progression, stabilization. This slide will be available. I've included the clinicaltrials.gov link for each of these. If you're interested in learning more from the observational study standpoint, there's some interesting studies that are upcoming or ongoing, one looking at subclinical transthyretin cardiac amyloidosis in V122I carriers. So again, individuals who don't who are positive for the genetic mutation but don't have disease currently. So what we're hoping to learn as part of the study is whether gene carriers of the V122I TTR mutation have early signs of heart disease and what that might look like. This could potentially help find ways to help physicians predict cardiovascular disease related to TTR cardiomyopathy and provide better care for these patients. That's the study that's being done out of Dallas, New York, and Cleveland. There's the Southeastern TTR Amyloidosis Consortium, the C-TRAC Family Registry, which will be starting up over the next few months. Again, looking to describe the clinical course of the disease and outcomes for asymptomatic carriers of V122I. There's a registry that's done in Canada, the Canadian Registry for Amyloidosis Research. This is a direct-to-patient registry portal, as well as has the option to have some health data collected at one of, I think, 5 different clinics across Canada. And so these are, again, just a fraction of the different studies that are currently ongoing. Because I have a couple minutes, I will just highlight there are 2 imaging trials that are currently ongoing right now that are looking at different molecular tracers to whether they are can be used to detect amyloid in the heart and other organs. So these are studies that are looking for patients who have suspected cardiac amyloidosis, have not been diagnosed, but have suspected cardiac amyloidosis. One of them is looking at the molecular tracer called Evuzamitide. And so this is a phase 3 study, started in Boston, but is currently being led by Sharmila Durbala at Brigham and Women's, but is currently recruiting at 7 of 22 planned centers in the US. And so if you're somebody who has suspected cardiac amyloidosis or a family member looking to get diagnosed, this could be something that would be of interest to you. Likewise, there's another molecular tracer being studied called Florbetaben. This is something that's actually approved to detect amyloid in Alzheimer's disease, but is in this study being used to evaluate whether it could potentially be used to detect amyloid in the heart for patients who have AL or TTR amyloidosis. And so this is a study that's going to enroll 200 patients across the world at 14 different centers. They've got 3 centers that are recruiting in the US currently, one in Kansas City and then Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. And so I'll wrap all this up by saying those who are interested in participating in clinical trials or considering doing so can stay informed of trials, of different trial opportunities in different ways. Clinicaltrials.gov is a publicly available and federally mandated national database of clinical trials. So anybody can go on that, search for a particular condition, a particular treatment to find the trials that are currently recruiting or have completed. With that said, I've searched clinicaltrials.gov myself many times, and it can be challenging to use. If you search for something general like amyloidosis or amyloid, you will also find all of the Alzheimer's studies that are recruiting. And so it can be challenging to weed out which are the ones that are actually most relevant to you, a patient with TTR amyloidosis. Talking to your healthcare provider is a great way to stay informed, as well as following patient organizations like ARC, the amyloidosis support groups, ASG, different country-specific patient groups. We do our best to keep patients informed of different trials that are starting and coming up. And so patient groups are an excellent way. The last one I'll highlight is a tool called My Amyloidosis Pathfinder, MAP for short. ARC developed an online tool called MAP to help patients with amyloidosis get connected to treatment centers and clinical trials specific to their type of amyloidosis and symptoms. And so anybody can access MAP. We'll drop the link in the chat as soon as I stop talking. You can sign up. Patients or caregivers can sign up, answer a few questions about your type of amyloidosis, so what type you have, if you know it, what organs are involved, what prior treatment experience you have. And then once your profile is completed, you're going to be matched to trials that you might potentially be eligible for, as well as see treatment centers that are geographically located in your vicinity. And so each time a new trial comes up, we'll add it. You'll be notified that there's a new trial that you might be eligible for. And so it's a great way to stay informed and ultimately help advance research towards better treatment and a cure for amyloidosis. And so, thank you so much. Really appreciate all your time. Please, we'll send out a survey, a post-meeting survey after this. Your feedback is tremendously helpful as we think about how we can improve individual talks, but then too, if there are topics that are of interest, future sessions that we can plan. And then I'll just end by saying that if you benefited from this ARC Talks webinar or any of our other work, please consider donating to the organization. We depend on your support to continually offer this and other programs. And so really appreciate your support and look forward to continuing to support patients through their journey. And so with that, I will stop and take a breath. Sorry.
Thank you, Kristen. Just a wealth of information, really amazing hearing everything that is going on, and your knowledge and detail on all of these is extraordinary, and so great to hear. We do have quite a lot of questions, and so in the time we have left, there are quite a number of questions around PN and CM, and why are some trials only for PN or only CM? And even with the wild type, why are there no wild type ATTR-PN trials. So just understanding the differences between the two and why it's structured like that would be helpful.
Yeah, good questions. So I'll start with the PN to CM, so neuropathy versus cardiomyopathy. And so we know that patients with TTR amyloidosis tend to get amyloid fibrils depositing either or both in nerves or cardiomyopathy. And so when you design a trial, you have to have a measurement that you're going to use to assess whether the drug works or not. And so the endpoints that are used to the measurements that are used for neuropathy studies are very different from the measurements that are used for cardiomyopathy studies. We saw historically, like the polyneuropathy studies use what's commonly known, it's the modified neuropathy impairment scale or score, I think. And so it's a neuropathy assessment. And you can see over an 18-month time period that treatments are having an effect there. Whereas in a cardiomyopathy, you can't use that same measurement. It has traditionally been a measurement of how long patients are living, if it's able to reduce hospitalizations, cardiovascular events, and that takes years, much longer than the 18-month time point. And so as a matter of how you design a study in the hope that it's has the best chance of being successful, the two have kind of been split and are studied differently. And so that's why we have some drugs that are available and approved for neuropathy, because they did those studies and were able to show it, but now they're separately doing studies in cardiomyopathy that have different time frames. And so that's kind of why it was split. It was really to try to give, it was the most efficient path forward for drug development to get the hands in patients as quickly as possible. Separately, neuropathy for wild type patients is a hard one because we still don't understand that much about it yet. And so just fun, like traditionally everybody thought that wild type TTR amyloidosis was entirely a disease of cardiomyopathy. And so like neuropathy in wild type wasn't really even on the radar. And so all the studies that have been done have been designed around cardiomyopathy. We're just now, as more and more patients are being diagnosed with wild type, we're starting to learn more and more about it, but the knowledge around what neuropathy looks like in wild type hasn't caught up to the level that we are able to, the community is able to design a study to see whether those treatments could actually impact it. There's also a little bit of a difference between whether you have neuropathy because you've got amyloid deposited in your peripheral nerves, which is what traditionally TTR polyneuropathy is, versus you might be experiencing neuropathy related to carpal tunnel syndrome, where you've got amyloid deposits that are actually depressing the space between in the carpal tunnel versus actually in the nerves itself. So it is slightly different. I'm hoping we'll get there, but we're just not there yet. It takes a long time to accumulate and understand the disease to be able to effectively design a trial in which you can measure whether a drug has the intended effect or not.
And so this kind of follow-on question to that is there are a few questions around why there appear to be no anti-fibril studies for PN to be on the cardiomyopathy.
Yeah. So my personal opinion, and this is Kristen's opinion and no one else, is that so right now designing a trial in polyneuropathy can be challenging because there are already a number of products that are approved in polyneuropathy. And so to do a study and show that your treatment is having an effect over these other treatments can be challenging. Separately, there are a lot more patients who have cardiomyopathy, and when you're developing a treatment, you're going to go after, if you can, the biggest population where you can have the biggest impact. And so I think drug developers are obviously attracted by the larger TTR cardiomyopathy space. But again, it really comes to I think what you'll see is that where earlier on drug developers started with polyneuropathy because they were shorter studies with better known endpoints, and then moved on to cardiomyopathy. We're now kind of in the reverse where drug developers are starting with cardiomyopathy, and then you're going to start to see these follow on like PN studies, similar to what we're seeing with like CRISPR-Cas9. Intellia is starting with CM, but are planning a PN study, and Alnylam for nucresiran, they're starting with CM, but they're planning a PN study. So I expect it'll come, but it's going to they're starting with cardiomyopathy and want to see that it's effective before moving to a smaller patient population.
And there were a couple of questions around the Intellia study, and one of them was around the inclusion-exclusion criteria, and it's quite high for NT-proBNP, and is that likely to change? Do you have any sense on that?
Yeah, so they actually did lower the NT-proBNP inclusion criteria. So initially, I want to say you had to have a level of 1,000. I can go back to the slide. Picograms per liter. My units are not so good. It was initially 1,000, and they've actually recently lowered the entry criteria to 600. So it allows for a less severe, I can bring the slide back up, patient population to enroll. Let me bring this up. Sorry, this is still Triton, but let me bring up the Intellia one. Yep. Okay. So now it's NT-proBNP levels of greater than 600 picograms per milliliter. And so they did drop that. One of the things that we are seeing is that, again, in order to develop a product and see whether it has the intended effect, is that you have to expect that without treatment, patients would decline over a certain period of time. And so that's why you see many of these trials are targeting patients who have more significant heart involvement, because we understand without treatment how quickly they might decline without getting treatment. As more and more patients are being diagnosed with TTR cardiomyopathy, they're being diagnosed earlier in the course of their disease, which is fantastic. It's exactly what we want. But we don't understand yet how quickly they might progress. And so that's why, and it would presumably take them longer to progress, which means for longer studies, more patients. And so that's why they tend to not be eligible for these studies until they've reached a certain point.
Excellent. Thank you, Kristen. I know we are now at time. I know there were quite a lot of other questions. If you click on the chat, the two little bubbles in the bottom, I've included a link to both the My Amyloidosis Pathfinder tool, and also if you have questions that weren't answered, please feel free to reach out to us at support@archi.org. There was just one last question, Kristen, which I think I'm right in saying this, but correct me if I'm wrong. There was a question whether if you were in Canada, would you be able to get information about clinical trials? And I believe if you use the MAP tool, you can put in that you're in Canada, and it will give you the sites that are open in Canada.
Yep.
So, yeah. Okay, excellent. Phew. Thank you again. And really just so exciting to see how much development there is in ATTR. I know it can feel long and frustrating and challenging if there's a patient trying to find trials that work, and we so desperately need more and better treatment. So participating in research if you can, and participating in a clinical trial is a really good thing to do. And thank you. We will be sharing these and the slides as well afterwards. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.